Hello, and welcome to another episode of NPR Radio Live. Here I have a special host, Dave, who is a book expert and an analyst.
Great to be here, Keaton.
Thank you. Okay, today we are discussing the final chapters of the book Bright-Sided by Barbara Ehrenreich.
Yes, that is correct.
So the first thing that we're going to look at is the so-called happiness equation that Seligman brings up on page 157 in the late chapters of the book. So what are your thoughts about this happiness equation?
Well, first of all, how the author writes is there's no variable that can be used to measure happiness, like how you feel per day or how many happy thoughts you have an hour. Like how does that even factor into the happiness equation itself? There's just no variables to be able to compute it. So that's the first problem with it. And then the variables themselves are kind of off. What are the variables again?
So interesting. So the happiness equation written in the book is the level of happiness equals set range plus circumstance plus voluntary control. So the question is, how do you measure those, and how are they accurate between each person?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was getting at. The units, it's impossible to have units for happiness. So the equation just doesn't make sense in general. Theoretically, it's an interesting concept to think about, but in practice, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
So after Ehrenreich's unfortunate encounter with Seligman, we're going to skip to the end of the book.
Actually, I'd like to touch on that interaction.
Okay, so what were your thoughts on it?
Just from the very beginning between Ehrenreich and Seligman, it just seemed that Seligman was trying to hide something, and he didn't actually want to have a conversation about his concept of positive psychology. Right when she walked in the door, he directed her to meet two, clients of his, I guess, and to talk to them about positive psychology. And then after she was done with that, he directed her into his room where he was just having a long conversation and didn't even offer her a seat. And then even though Ehrenreich withstood that and waited till he finished the conversation, Seligman just directed them to a museum instead of an actual interview, which I thought was just another example of how he was just trying to, lead her on and not really try to have an actual conversation about positive psychology.
Do you think this book was written with a bias towards Seligman just because we're looking at the problems with positive psychology?
I mean, there's definitely a bias there. You can see that in sort of the way that Ehrenreich describes Seligman, the diction that she uses. She mentions that he's like balding or something like that, and short and has a high temper.
Yeah.
Things like that. There is a bias there. However, I do think it has quite a bit of credibility, but it is important to point out she is biased towards her view and not towards Seligman and positive psychology.
Yeah. Okay, now for the sake of time, we're going to run to the end of the book and touch on the quote that says, about 90% of Americans in households earning at least $250,000 a year report being very happy. Do you think there is a correlation between money and happiness?
Yeah, definitely. But to a certain point. So if you're earning $30,000 a year, that's, I don't know, if both people are working in the household, then that's, I don't know, $15,000 a year, which is probably right around where minimum wage will make you. So if you're at $32,000 or $30,000 rather, then yeah, the chances of you being happy are low. But what actually surprised me more is the $250,000 number and how 90% of people making that amount of money felt happy. I think that number should have been higher compared to the 42% that the 30,000 earners made, because 250,000 is 8 times bigger than 30,000, and 90% is only twice as big as 42%. So it kind of drops off after a certain point. I don't know what that number is. It'd be interesting to look at, but money does correlate with happiness, but I think only up to a certain point, and then it will slow down eventually.
Interesting. So, I had the opportunity to go to China over the summer, which has quite a bit of people with a lot less money, and they appeared to be very happy. Do you think this equation is only for Americans? And you think it might be something put on by our culture here?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, Ehrenreich sort of described at the beginning of the book that positive thinking and thinking, I don't know, optimistically is sort of an American,
Like an ideal or something?
yeah, like an American like way of just thinking in general. So I think that, well, the equation, putting the equation and it not making like sense aside, I would think that it would only apply to Americans just because just because we do, I think, tend to think more positively than other countries. I think that point that Ehrenreich makes is correct. So I do think that that equation really only applies to Americans and maybe to other Western countries as opposed to China or other poor nations.
Interesting. Okay, well, thank you for coming in today, and
Always a pleasure.
thank you for listening. This is NPR Radio, and we're out.